Hi everyone, this is my second attempt at doing this video. Please bear with me, it's the first video of this channel. So this channel is going to focus on two things. It's going to focus on gaming related to primarily military games, but it's mainly going to also relate to strategy games. And the other aspect is going to relate to military history. Now, I've been encouraged by myself, inspired by seeing things like Lindy Bage's channel, which I recommend everybody does. But I noticed he mainly focuses on the societal aspects and the cultural aspects of historical civilizations and stuff, which I think is extremely important. It gets neglected all the time. So I figured, why not do a more military-oriented channel, especially since I have this beauty of a helmet, even though it's not an original SSH 40. Those are the helmets the Russians used in the war. I figured it's not an original SSH 40. I think it's Czech, probably a Czech copycat. Still pretty cool though. I have an original Luftschutz waffle. What that? Luftschutz staff and helmet, whatever it's called. I have one of those actually up here, but I'm titling this video actually the most important. That sounded weird. The most important month of human history, arguably, in all of human history. And you're wondering, how could you do that? How could you prioritize that in such a way? Well, I guess I could say in modern history, because it's more difficult with ancient sources. We don't know as much, but this is the cake. In modern history, this is the most important month primarily because this took place in the Second World War. And the Second World War was so important because it changed our world order. For the first time in human history, we had a unipolar world. I mean, the British Empire dominated before, but you still had competitive empires still fighting each other. The first time you had a truly unipolar world with a whole maelstrom of international diplomacy that completely reshaped our world. And it became, if you've studied IR, it's pretty much transformed into a liberal world, whereas it used to be kind of like a realistic, realism IR theory. Because you now have the you had Bretton Woods still, you have the UN Security Council, and a bunch of things. So that's an important thing to notice. But anyway, I'm gonna get to the video. Don't want to ramble. This is about the most important month in history, and that month took place on September 1941. September 1941. Arguably to mid-October as well. It could extend it to a month and a half. And what was it? Well, when I was a kid, when I was about 14, one of my mom's friends, he saw that I was reading something on World War II, on Russia, and he was like, "Hey Daniel, do you know that the Russians lost?" And that's not his accent. "Do you know that the Russians lost because of the winter?" And I'm like, that's a bit too simple to be true. But I didn't know how to answer it. I was gonna go like, "Oh, what about the Battle of Stalingrad?" But still, that's not like an appropriate rebuttal, using a battle against the weather. But now I do have a rebuttal because I've learned a lot these past years. And the rebuttal is that September was the most important month for one reason. The reason was the Rasputitsa. Finally got that right. The Rasputitsa is the wet period between September and October every year in Russia, where it rains a heck of a lot, comparable to hurricane season in Florida. And essentially what happens is, if you have unpaved roads, which were about half of the roads in Western Russia at the time, you have problems. They become untraversable because the muddiness pretty much makes it armored vehicles, even cars they can't pass it. Even horses cannot go through that. And you have a lot of pictures to testify on this. You have Germans trying to like pull their horses, kind of like in a Artax situation. If you've ever seen the Never-Ending Story, you know, you're the kid and you're pulling the horse and it won't move. Well, that's pretty much what happened to half the German army. But I have to give you a bit of context also why that was so important. I mean, you're gonna be like, oh, it bought them time, so what? More to that, but I have to go about a year and a half earlier, to actually no, I have to go to 1936, so about 5 years earlier, to when Russia wasn't, well, the Soviet Union wasn't as bad of a place as it was. It was still pretty bad though, but you had a guy called Marshal Tukhachevsky, and he was a smart dude. He fought in the Russian Civil War. And fighting in the Russian Civil War, he noticed something. He was like, we're fighting a lot of enemies. We're fighting enemies in Vladivostok. We're fighting enemies in Arkhangelsk. And we're fighting enemies in Crimea. Why are we fighting everyone everywhere? How are we going to survive? Obviously, we have to start moving troops and making them really fluid. Send a couple hundred troops to Vladivostok. Send them to Lake Baikal, send them to Arkhangelsk, then send them to Minsk, then send them here, and keep the fronts dynamic and fluid and changing constantly. But the country's huge. How the heck can you do that in such a huge country? Well, aha. Mechanization. This is where mechanization was born, and this is where the world's most unknown rivalry happened between Budeni and Tukhachevsky, which ultimately led to his death. So essentially, Tukhachevsky came up with a battle doctrine called deep battle, pretty much where you pile a crap ton of mechanized forces into a spot, you make a breakthrough, then they start pouring out everywhere and circling like a swarm of flies, and they just start attacking the industry and stuff. That's why it's called deep battle, because it's deep into the enemy. Yeah. So it's kind of like Blitzkrieg, but I don't feel like it relied too much on air power, because Blitzkrieg, in my opinion, relied excessively on air power. And when the Germans started losing air superiority in the Eastern Front was when Blitzkrieg essentially died out. And you could sort of see that in Operation Bagration in 1944, but I'm not going to go there. So, this helmet's actually kind of hurting a little bit. How do people wear this? So, 1936, Russia could have actually beaten the Germans. They had a really good doctrine compared to the Germans. The Germans almost had no tanks, and they were at the start of sending their forces to Spain to help the nationalists. So Tukhachevsky, unfortunately, gets executed in the Great Purges, even though it's a bit more hush-hush, since I guess they don't want people to know that they were killing their own military commanders, which was funny because the guy who did the purges, Yakovy, I forgot his name, he ended up getting executed by Stalin as well, so, ooh, it's a Game of Thrones-esque episode. But anyway, so he gets killed off. He was the chief of staff. Very sad. So this sort of reverses things back to a more traditionalist sense. Budyani kind of wins the argument, and he loves cavalry. He's a cavalry file, a horso file, whatever. And he's like, cavalry should be the priority, and blah, blah, blah. So start focusing on cavalry units. Mechanization takes sort of backroom priority. Nobody really cares about it. They, at one point, they don't even have mechanized corps anymore, which is ridiculous for an army that's so big. Oh my god. What the hell is that? So anyway, flash forward to 1940. You have the Winter War happening, late 1939, 1940. The Russians are having a disaster right there. Shaposhnikov is the chief of staff, and he's doing a terrible job of it. The Russians lose about 200,000 soldiers. They gain territory, but to no avail. So Shaposhnikov, eventually gets replaced by Meretskov, right? Now, Meretskov, he's actually not that bad. He's quite competent. But then you have war games. Yes, they did war games back then. In December 1940, he was supposed to be the Russian team, and he implemented a strategy, using the doctrine against Zhukov, who was supposed to be the enemy team, and he lost. He lost real bad. So there's a story where he was going to Stalin and he was like mumbling, like he couldn't even give him a report because he was kind of embarrassed. So Stalin just fires him. He didn't kill him though, but he fired him, and he just replaced him with Zhukov, Georgy Zhukov. And just to give you a bit more context, not to confuse you, go back to August 1939. The Soviets and the Japanese are in an undeclared border war/skirmish in Mongolia, because Mongolia was essentially a Soviet satellite state, and Manchuria. But either side hasn't really scored a decisive low-key victory. So Zhukov comes, he's an old disciple of Chizhikevsky, and he employs deep battle. And he decimates the Japanese army, kills or takes 60,000 people prisoner. So he essentially destroys an entire Japanese army. And this sort of deters the Japanese from ever screwing with the Russians again, until 1945 when the Russians invade Manchuria. Soviets, sorry. It's a bad habit. So this kind of sets the precedent for Zhukov to sort of secure that eventual promotion in which he becomes the chief of staff in January 1941. So, but that's not enough time, there's too much fluidity in leadership. You've had like 3 chiefs of staff in like less than a year and a half. It's insane. Like, because of the purges, it was also normal for officer rotations to go like that, from division commanders to brigade commanders, regiments, up to the highest officers. So they didn't even know. And this really affected things. And they were lacking supply. A lot of Russian tanks didn't even have radios. Let's put it that way. And they did start pumping out T-34s and KV-1s, but there weren't that many of them. There were about 500 by the time the war started of those 2 variants. And they did great when they were concentrated. They really kicked butt because German anti-tank guns couldn't even penetrate their sloped armor, and German tanks had a hard time picking them off. So they were actually really good. But now I've set the scene. I've shown you how chaotic, at least in 10 minutes, how chaotic the swapping of officers was because of the Great Purge, deep battle doctrine versus cavalry doctrine, all this hullabaloo, all this hullabaloo. And the German army wasn't as prepared as people think because of Barbarossa. I mean, they pretty much screwed up their air force quite a lot. They actually had a smaller air force, technically, on the onset of Barbarossa than they did when they bombed Britain. But they were still in the peak of their power. They only had like 100 fewer bombers, and their transport fleet was pretty much depleted because of the Battle of Crete and the Balkan campaign. But anyway, let's get to Barbarossa. So now we're in Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. On the first day alone, 1,200 Soviet aircraft are destroyed on the ground. They can't even be used. The good thing is a lot of them are obsolete. The bad news is it's a lot of aircraft. So the Soviet Union, you have the Pripyat marshes, which are these huge marshes in present-day Belarusia and I think eastern Poland, that essentially divided the campaign into 2 parts. So don't think of people think of Army Group North, Army Group Center, and then Army Group South. Really, I'd call it Army Group North, and then Army Group North, and then Army Group South, because that's really what it was. And, sorry, just looking at my phone. So essentially, you had a successful attack in Army Group North and Army Group Center, led by Fedor von Bock, decimating the Soviets, encircled an army of Soviets, captured about 400,000 in Minsk in the first week of the invasion. That's crazy. That is absolutely insane. They even penetrated Vilnius like 2 days after the invasion started, and they swept into Latvia, reaching the area around Riga. By the first week and a half as well, it was insane. But the South was a different story. And this also had to do with the Soviet strategy of how to deal with war, which partially explains why it was a bit easier for the Germans to attack in the north. So essentially, the Soviets, before Barbarossa commenced, they actually prioritized their equipment and their resources on the southern front, the southwestern front. And that's pretty much where all the best troops went, I think, the best equipment as well. And that's where a lot of the better prepared mechanized corps of the Soviet army came. Because I said earlier that the Soviets kind of scraped that, but starting 1939 with Zhukov getting influence, they started rebuilding their mechanized corps, and they had some, even though they were undermanned and under-equipped. So now, the Germans were actually having more difficulty with Army Group South. They were trying to penetrate, and they technically encircled this fort on the border called Brest-Litovsky, but they couldn't capture it for like a week and a half. And in the time when it took the Germans only 2 days to get to Vilnius and a week to encircle and destroy 3 armies in Minsk, resisting the Germans for a week and a half without communication lines was pretty damn impressive for the commander in Brest Fortress, as they call it now. So this set the tone. This was early July by the time, and the Germans were still struggling to really penetrate Kiev. The Soviets were really fortifying along the Dnieper River, and they had a layer of defensive belts, about 3 defensive belts around Kiev. So they were actually prepared with this sort of in-depth strategy for like an elastic defense to sort of counter German movements in the south. It was really effective. The north was just a little bit incompetent. And that's part of the reason why the general in charge of the defense of Minsk was executed, which was General Pavlov, just a week after. So now, fast forward, the Soviets start actually reacting a bit more successfully against Army Group Center. Well, not as much, but what's happening is essentially they have I think the 12th Army in the city of Smolensk, and it's undermanned, it's underpowered, it's the point of collapsing, but they have them there, and the Germans reach the outskirts of Smolensk in late July. Actually, no, in mid-July, I'd say, early July even, and they start penetrating the city. They start taking the city, and then they make a pincer movement. Heinz Guderian is in charge, panzers, and they encircle. The problem with that, I believe, Heinz Guderian actually didn't really have much motorized infantry support, so a lot of Soviet soldiers actually started escaping. This is a problem a lot of Germans found, that even though they encircled armies, a lot of the Soviets would just escape at night, just sneak like ninjas away, because tanks don't really have that range. They need infantry support to close that pocket efficiently and contain all those Soviet soldiers. So that's what happened. And then the Soviets send 3 armies, I believe, a couple of armies, to sort of counterattack the Germans. It becomes sort of a stalemate, but at the same time, I believe a small breakout is achieved where some Soviet soldiers are able to retreat. But the Germans obviously captured the vast majority of Soviets and destroyed about 2 or 3 armies at Smolensk. This is in early August, the 5th of August, I believe. So the battle rages on for a week or two, I would say. effectively. Even though I said early July is when it starts, that was in the outskirts. So I'm talking about the battle inside the city to the point where the last pocket of resistance is quelled. Yeah. So now the Soviets launch counteroffensive in mid-August. So you have like a little stalemate, but there is a bit of friction, and they're actually quite successful because there was a German bridgehead on a nearby river, and the Soviets actually pushed the Germans back, Heinz Guderian. So at this point, the situation at Kiev is still bad for the Germans. They haven't really penetrated the city. The Soviets have their best soldiers there. They have their mechanized corps there. Even though, funny enough, the bulk of the German army in Barbarossa was actually in Army Group Center and Army Group North. So it's funny, the bulk, like the most powerful Soviet units and the most powerful German units were literally opposite fronts from each other. So it was like a race against time. It was weird, but so Heinz Guderian wanted to keep driving to Moscow, but that wasn't actually the original objective of Barbarossa. The original objective was actually just to encircle and kill as many Soviets as possible. Moscow was more of a secondary objective that became a primary objective when the Germans realized the Soviets aren't going to surrender. So we kind of got to find a way to make them surrender by reducing their morale. So Heinz Guderian is kind of like ordered by Hitler to attack the south in a coordinated assault with Army Group South to encircle Kiev. And obviously what happens, he encircles Kiev. 600,000 soldiers are taken prisoner. It's the largest encirclement in human history. But that buys the Soviets crucial time, because at this point we're getting to early September, which is what the time period that I said was the most important in human history. And the reason, like I said, the Rasputista, which was the muddy period, it started setting in. The Germans at this point were exhausted and they were incurring casualties. And at this point, not many people know this, but the German army, the vast majority of its supply lines and logistical networks were actually drawn by horses. And if you see an episode from Band of Brothers, you'll see one of the final scenes where you have German POWs marching down a highway. Some of them are in wagons, riding horses, and one of the Americans stand up from a truck. And he's like, "You guys are pathetic. You guys are still riding horses." And that kind of is true. To carry supplies and whatnot, Germans really relied on horses a lot more than either the Russians, Soviets, and the Americans did. So that was a crucial factor, because you see a lot of pictures of horses, like I said, stuck in the mud, and you're trying to pull them out. And a lot of them died as well from the sporadic weather. But even cars got stuck because like I said, around 50% of roads in Western Russia were unpaved, which meant they became muddy and unusable. They weren't roads anymore, essentially, because they become soft and whatnot. So this, along with the fact that Russian railroad tracks couldn't even fit German trains, kind of put the icing on the cake. German trains, I believe, the railroad tracks were too wide for German trains to use. So Germans, what they had to do is they actually had to capture Russian trains, or they had to slowly convert the railroad tracks, which takes time and resources and was incredibly inefficient. So this situation, this month-long period, pretty much set the Germans dead on their tracks. Dead on their tracks. And part of the reason was the combined effort to deter the Germans at Smolensk and at Kiev. But they weren't what put the icing on the cake, because if you didn't have the Rasputitsa, they could have just renewed their offensive and they could have plausibly won. So the Rasputista really, really put the icing on the cake, and it bought the Soviets a month of time to do a defense in depth, layer their defensive belts around Moscow, entrench their positions, and call reinforcements from Siberia, the famous Siberian divisions, and replenish their supplies with more T-34s, more KV-1s, coming in, which were actually better than the Panzer III and Panzer IV counterparts. The T-34-76 was superb. But the thing is, when the war started, a lot of them were lacking radio, and the situation was improving. A lot of the industry moved to the Urals, so they could still keep producing at that rate. So this was the most important month that I just want you guys to understand, because the Germans could only renew their offensive to Moscow with Operation Typhoon, which was in October, late October, early November 1941. And that led to another thing, which was the Soviet winter, then led to the Soviet counterattack, which essentially prolonged the war, because the German objective was to have a victory very quickly. They wouldn't be able to sustain a war. And it showed, because they didn't even use their slave labor. They couldn't even use their slave labor from all those millions of Soviet POWs until 1942. So they were in no position to outproduce the Soviets in that regard. So that's why, in a brief 25-minute video, why this was such an important month. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching. I'll put a new video with me wearing another ridiculous helmet and telling you another story about history, military history. So see you guys, and thanks for watching.